So we're going
Do
to.
you have any update on React?
We have a React starter. You're welcome to check out and use.
Has it been approved to React yet?
Yes.
Yep.
So we're trying a different, kind of a different format this time. So hopefully it doesn't totally bomb. If it does, I'm sorry. Basically, what we're doing here is just a book report. So there's this book out there on the internet being written. It's not actually complete yet, but there's a lot of content in there. It's by, it's called Atomic Design. So I changed the name of this to Atomic Web Design and Dev because I didn't want to scare all the developers away. But really, it is about, it's more than just design. It's about design and development, particularly when you're designing and developing UIs. So the author of the book is Brad Frost, who's kind of he's known in the industry. He's a designer, a speaker, consultant. So a lot of this presentation is just me curating his comments, his words. So all praise and anger go to him. So the kind of the target of this book, just of the book in general, it really is anyone who's involved in creating, in the process of creating like a UI, an app that interacts with end users, and that's developers, designers, management. I think any one of those disciplines or any one of those roles would benefit to some degree from reading this book. Specifically, it talks a lot to, it seems it has this feel where it's talking to designers that are kind of coming from maybe a non-digital background. And also specifically, there's a lot of good information there for front-end developers or those who create and maintain user-facing apps and pages. So the book, it's conceptually instructive. So it's really about concepts and some philosophy. There's not a lot of code. It's more about mental models and thinking and setting things up in that direction. And there are he makes a lot of assertions, a lot of opinions, so a lot of statements, makes a lot of points. And kind of because of that format of the book, I'm leaning on more of a conversation today than kind of instruction. So please encourage you to interact more in this than maybe some other presentations. So in the beginning, he talks about the page or the web page, right? And in the very beginning of the web, each page was handcrafted. And kind of the origin of the internet or web pages was really so academics could easily share and link together their documents, right? It's very much document page based. That's kind of the origin. And the page has kind of been a metaphor from the very, very beginning of the web, right? And if you think about it, it really helped the adoption of the web. It helped people kind of reason about it and think about it, because before the web, there really wasn't, what would you call, even now I think we still struggle when we're talking about this. We still kind of refer to things in pages, right? But in the beginning, they called it a page because it helped people understand what you were dealing with. And that metaphor it still lives on today. Like your web page is not available screen, right? It's still very much a metaphor we use, right? But he argues that the way things are named, they very much impact how they're perceived, particularly by those maybe that aren't in our specialty or they don't do this type of work. They think about the fact that it's called a page may be doing some damage, basically, to their mental models, right? And because of that metaphor, you get comments like this. Like, we're a startup looking to launch a 5-page website this October. How long is that going to take? What is that going to cost? Right? How would you guys answer that? It depends on what?
5 pages of what?
5 pages of what? Right? That's basically the gist. Like, a page is just it's a bad measurement, right? Same thing. How long will it take to build the home page? Right? Is it going to be? It's just 1 versus 5. Is it going to be longer to build the home page versus the other 5? It depends. And what about, we have to redesign this university website. It contains over 30,000 pages. Like, out of these 3 scenarios, just with the information you have here, you have no idea which one of these things are going to be easier or harder, right? So the gist is the page itself it's a damaging metaphor in some regards because it kind of propagates a misunderstanding of what it is we're building. And just kind of how you guys commented and said, the effort and complexity is really determined by the functionality and the components contained within those pages, right? Not really the quantity of the pages. So it really depends on what you're doing. I mean, it could be very simple, it could be very hard. So kind of the fundamental mistake is kind of assuming a page is just this uniform, isolated, quantifiable thing. When in reality, the web is a fluid, bidirectional, independent medium. Does someone kind of explain that? Help me understand what that means. Anyone? It's magic, right? Like the page is magic. So what is the structure of a page compared to maybe like a web page compared to a traditional page?
I think what the page was good early on because our packets of data could only be so big in order to get back and forth. But as we get further and further into higher speeds and better internet connections and things like that, that data flow can be a lot more fluid, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And as we hit HTTP2 and other things, that data flow is not restricted as much.
So like compared to like an actual page, a piece of paper versus a page, like a page can change over time on the web, right? Yeah.
I would say there are times that a page would be the correct way to think about it. With things like just a simple content site, a page might be the correct way, but then there's other things like apps, and I'm not sure what other types of things can we put on the web.
So under that reasoning, if someone were to come and ask you to create a simple content site for 5 pages without any more details, do you feel comfortable quoting that? Or would you need more information?
So a little more comfortable.
Like that, you feel like that gets like in a smaller box potentially of the, maybe. Yeah. So he kind of talks about uniform, isolated, quantifiable, fluid, bidirectional, interdependent. Anyone want to kind of take shots on what those things mean?
So the page concept, you tend to think of it, well, I only navigated in one direction. We're usually navigating at least in 2 directions and often in more directions than that. So we're not talking necessarily about a linear progression of events. We're talking about events that can happen in any order.
So even like summarize, you can, in a book, you navigate pages sequentially, right, linearly. Where the experience on the web, if you still kind of hold on to that page, the way you navigate pages, you don't have that same linear type of experience.
If you look at like Google Docs and stuff like that, it's a much more collaborative, interactive type experience with multiple users simultaneously interacting. So it's a lot different than opening up a book and just reading something. So it's, I think that's a good example of how it is more collaborative and interactive. Yeah,
for sure. It's like the page is changing as you're there, and it's changing based on how people are interacting with it, right? Like paper pages don't really do that, right? At least I know.
I had a similar take on bidirectional. That can mean bidirectional data flow, not just navigation, but like for some web applications, you probably send more data to the server than the server sends to you.
Yep. So it's both consumption and production based, where the person interacting with the page is more than just consuming something. They're also contributing to it or something else. Yeah. Yeah.
So engaging content kind of is the fluid and bidirectional. You think of a printed page, it's a static entity.
Right.
You look at it today, you look at it tomorrow, it's going to be the same thing. But you look at the web, if that's your experience, you've been there once, no one's coming back.
Right.
So your content wants to adapt constantly in order to keep that attention and in order to portray whatever information is changing behind it.
So to paraphrase, you take a book and you put it in the presses, and it goes out the presses, and it's the same forever. Whereas a web page, like some pages change all the time, like maybe on every page load potentially, right? Okay.
So it's fluid in the sense that it's almost like, rather than a page, it's a little more like origami. Whereas that page folds and unfolds in various shapes. throughout based on users' interaction.
So the experience is gonna be shifting and customized really to how you interact with it, right? And that varies based on context, whether that's the person or what they're doing or how they're interacting with it. But even the shape of the page changes based on context, which can range from anything from the device they're on to how they interact with it to any number of things, correct? Okay. Anything else? These are very good comments, thank you. So he talks about here what the difference between regular design in a page and maybe web design or app design. This also applies not just for the web, but like native apps as well. What constitutes good design? I mean, that's changed and shifted in this paradigm as well, because now you have to account for speed and screen size, the environment, the technological capabilities, form factor, ergonomics, usability, accessibility, context, user preferences. All these things now are factors when you have to consider what is a good design. It's way more complex than the page of a book, right? And so this is the entire point he's making, is that the word page itself is probably doing at this point more damage. And again, these are kind of those unique design considerations that you have to consider when building a page, a web page, right? Pixel density, scrolling performance, browser quirks, all these things. There's just a ton of other contextual things you have to account for, and good design needs to integrate these variables into that. So his first main point is that we're 25 years in this new medium, and maybe at one point in time this figure of speech was necessary, but it's overstayed its welcome, and it's time to evolve beyond the page. Does anyone have heartburn with that comment? No? All right, so moving forward, the explosion of the web. Let's talk about the web and building for the web. Right? This is not the web. These are graphics straight out of his book, by the way. This, at least according to when he created this image, is the web, right? You go to a URL, depending on what you're on, it's going to adapt to where you're at. And this will be the web, which basically is just this explosion of devices, right? He says it's just the landscape of devices. And if you think about context, that we're going to have to account for, it's going to explode. I mean, we have to account for this huge range of variance. And, he says we're drowning in a sea of devices, right? And a piece of content, think about a piece of content, it's being viewed in many different shapes and sizes, right? Maybe you have an article that, there's maybe its main experience on some platforms that it's going to vary depending on the context, like whether it's an ad or a search result, or but basically a piece of content is going to be viewed in many multiple formats. So the web is crazy. I mean, really, it's a very challenging platform because there's really no stability in anything. Everything varies on the web. So it talks about leveling up now. Things like how do we kind of move past the page and all maybe the habits and mental models and things like that we need to account for and adjust for. And he really kind of breaks it down into sections, right? So it talks about leveling up with development. And really he says to maintain sanity, we need smaller, more manageable chunks. And I think we're kind of seeing the trends and buzzwords and things like that are happening right now, where we have components and node modules, CSS modules, microservices, all these things really to help us kind of break down this big, giant, complex problem into kind of really smaller, manageable chunks. There's probably a number of other buzzwords or concepts that I didn't include on the slide that really kind of deal with this idea of, in order to kind of maintain our sanity and to be able to manage such large, complex things, we have to break them down into super small chunks that are easy to reason about to maintain all that. Any comments or questions on that? No? Yeah? So in development world, in a very fast-paced, changing thing where there's a lot of variance and a lot of change, a lot of context to account for, modularity is kind of what really helps us deal with that. But then he goes on to say that spirit of modularity is not just affecting development. It's also changing even organizational structures to some degree. Their strategy, their process, their content, their design, and in addition to their development, right? So it talks about leveling up design and thinking more modularly and what that looks like, how you have to change design to account for that, right? He says it's untenable to produce static mock-ups of every page on a web experience, right? And I would even further, like it's almost impossible to do that for a single page and account for all the variants within that page. Like, I mean, that's just a ton of work to be able to create a static, like Photoshop mock-up of every possible state of a page. Okay, agree, disagree? Agree? One of my favorite quotes here, Photoshop comps, the most effective way to show your clients what their website will never look like. And then he gets into talk about, okay, well, if that's not working, what are we doing? How do we move forward? They're not designing pages. They're designing systems of components. So even the design mind frame has to change from the monolithic page to the parts of the page, right?
So this is the question I've had this whole presentation is, so we're not designing pages anymore. Are we designing apps, or what term should we use?
We'll get there, I promise. Okay. So some of the things, like some of the process and design that needs to change, they have to get stakeholders comfortable with reviewing works in progress rather than full-on comps. So what's the danger potentially of showing your clients full-on comps?
They expect you to deliver full-on comps right away.
So they expect it to look exactly like that? I mean,
Exactly. Fix it perfect.
is that what you said? I'm sorry.
Yeah, they expect you to deliver just that, and then, they don't want to, sometimes they don't even want to see it until they can see the full-on comp and it's all done.
Right. What happens if you show them that comp early on? I mean, versus what happens in reality? Like they don't line up? Because there's just so much variance to happen to account for that, yeah.
And there's a perception that, hey, it's done. Like, we could have that all week, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, if it looks good, then they assume it works good too.
Gotcha. Did you have a hand up?
No. So I've found that a lot of times they look at it and then they start thinking. And by the time you go to deliver what you showed them in the beginning, they say, well, that's not what we want anymore. We want this other thing, which is completely different, because they looked at the design and they thought about, ooh, what can we do more?
Yeah.
And so they move your target on you.
The target moves, yep. In addition to that, right, like that mock-up doesn't capture all the interactivity that happens. Like it never accounts for, the weird edge cases of things that you can't really design for. So it's really just, the harm is you're misleading them, honestly. So he recommends getting the design into the browser as fast as possible so that you can confront them with something more realistic. You're not misleading them maybe as much. I don't know. Whereas with that, pixel perfect Photoshop comp, you have everything all nice with, everything lines up when everything's perfect, but it's never that way in reality. So kind of moving away from giant Photoshop comps, he talks about different strategies like style tiles, element collages, pattern libraries. There's a number of things that you can still show a client without like doing the damage of showing them the page mocked up.
So you're saying like create some kind of storybook?
I am. Yep, I am. So like a storybook of components, yes. So that's talking about design. He's also talking about leveling up content. How do you shift your content? We have to dramatically overhaul our tools, is what he's saying, to account for the diversity that we have to deal with. Get your content ready to go everywhere because it's going everywhere. And basically you need well-designed chunks of content that we can then figure out how we want to restructure it, publish it, display in a way that's going to be right for that appropriate use case or platform or whatever the case may be.
What does he mean by content here?
So
Does he mean visual
he means
content?
the things your users are basically interacting with is kind of is the content. So on a consumption-heavy site, that might be like articles, or like LDS Store, articles and talks, a listing of temples. But it also applies, on a more bi-directional way as well, where your users are both consuming and creating the content.
So would it be fair to say that by content he means the data and the display of the data?
I think he means the data and get the data ready to be displayed in multiple ways.
I think the further you can separate the content from the display of the content, the more this second part of this is that's going to be right for the appropriate platform. Because if you attach that display too much into the content, now you can't reuse it in other platforms. You can't spread it around.
For sure, that's why I asked, because I think that the data ought to be completely separate, but
Yeah, I agree.
I'm a little bit confused with the way he's using it.
So it goes into like domain models versus view models. Okay, depending on your background, that may make more. This is my interpretation of what he's saying. That if you're storing your view model, a view model in the database, you're not prepared to go everywhere. You're prepared to go in one view, right? So he talks about leveling up teams. Here he makes some very kind of maybe bolder statements. Front-end developers are often relegated to crude production machines that are brought into the project only after all the design decisions are made. He says this archaic process keeps disciplines out of sync with each other and prevents teams from working together in a meaningful way. This, of course, is a huge mistake. Agree? Disagree?
Can you copy that and just send it to every developer in the building, and every solutions manager?
I can send a link to the book. Yeah.
Now we should highlight that.
So he goes further. Creating a division between designer and front-end developer is an absolutely terrible idea. It is crucial to treat front-end developers as a core part of the design process. Agree, disagree with that? Anyone disagree with these statements? So why do you agree? I mean, I imagine you're speaking from experience, like, 'cause it rings true, right? How so? I mean, it does to me as well, but.
A lot of times we get a design that looks ideal in the eyes of the designer, and can't say no. A lot of times the user's experience has not been thought through, for example. Sometimes it's just about, and different designers do things differently. Some of them do a great job with this and some of them don't. But a lot of times the actual logic behind it, the nature of what the display is going to look like, working out with it in mobile versus a desktop has not really been considered. How things flow between the two, consistency. A lot of these things that we live and breathe every day with development are not even part of the design process.
We just think differently, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we think differently. Sorry.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. If you get a bunch of people in the room that think the exact same things, you're not going to get new ideas.
Yeah.
If you get a whole bunch of people in the room that think differently, now you're going to get really cool ideas. You're going to get things that push the envelope, new creative ways to solve things that are better.
So you get people who all think the same, and you all have all these people sharing the same blind spot, right? And whether that's all designers or all developers, it's just all you're changing out is the blind spot. So the gist is you put them together, you're going to help eliminate those biases or blind spots right here.
I think balance is important though. Sometimes we can get kind of like self-righteous as developers. Be like, no, it's not possible. Where I've had a number of growth opportunities because I was given designs that I didn't think were within the realm of possibility. I was forced to figure out ways to accomplish them.
I agree.
So I think you can balance that.
So I think even like designer and developers together challenge each other,
Yeah.
right? They help each other grow.
I think also design and developers work together to kind of dictate how the process of it is going to go. So that the developer can tell them if this design is actually going to be something that can be reused across the entire site. It's easier to develop and can give them more of a timeline based off that design, so that they can then determine whether or not it's going to be worth it to go forward with the design.
So it helps you make just better design choices when you understand the consequences of potential decisions.
Another part of that is if you're in an environment where you have a front end and a back end developer, two separate guys doing two separate tasks, it's very rare that we would see a front end developer do everything they want to do, have it all done, and then hand it off to the back end developer. When you have them working together throughout the process, you understand the contracts that you're setting up, you understand limitations and the whole process. And so when there's silos, I mean, this is a recurring theme. I mean, when there's silos, things aren't done as well. And usually when I work with a designer that's got, that I say, you know, this is gonna be really challenging, are you sure this is what they want? A lot of times they're saying, oh, I didn't know that was gonna be challenging, and I don't really care about it. Just scrap it, or
Right.
let's just do it this way.
Right.
And they're great people who are willing to work with us for the most part. It's just a matter of.
Oftentimes they don't understand the nuances of a particular choice, and they're not necessarily attached to that, right? So kind of on that same type of theme of working together in silos, it says leveling up people. It says you can have all the right technology in place, you can have all the best tools, the best talent, but if everyone involved isn't actually cooperating and communicating with each other, then you're not going to create great work. It's as simple as that. Anyone disagree with that assertion he made? I found that to be true in my experience. So he talks about leveling up the process. Basically, get rid of the whole. I mean, this is about is waterfall and cooperation? I mean, those things don't really go hand in hand, right? So he talks about waterfall from UX design to visual design to development. Someone want to just briefly explain the difference between UX design and visual design? Anyone? Colt?
Now that I try to put it into words, UX design is really focused on bringing in business requirements, what is needed from the business side, and what is needed from the user side. And a lot of the art of UX design is being able to pull those requirements from both sides out and put them together, and to be able to distill them in some kind of an interface. And ideally, that interface is very rough, very hard, and it's a process to get it through all those steps. Once you be able to harden those steps, harden those requirements, get all of that stuff together, all of the user requirements, user needs, all of that stuff into an interface, then it can be visually designed and how the presentation plays into that function. So it's kind of distilling everything into how something should function, including the visual design. And the visual design is just how the function joins together with the way it's visually.
So what would be the product of a UX designer versus the product of a visual designer? What would be the outcomes? What would they?
The UX design, you probably get several different products. You get the three core ones that I always try to have designed on every project is a set of scenarios, a set of personas, and a user journey map. And then from those, distilled into a functional wireframe, a functional spec that says, hey, here's how this thing is, here's how it works, broken down into components and how it works as a system. So it's more about the description of how things work. That's the core of what you get from UX design.
So the end users are on your site for a particular reason, you hope, a task.
You know what those tasks are.
You know what those tasks are.
You know the purposes behind everything.
You know why, motivation, why they're there. And the UX designer is basically, they're trying to create the solution to those problems, right? Where the visual designer would be more concerned with
How they feel on the site.
how they feel. Okay. Anyone else to add to that?
But how they feel, sorry.
My take is UX design is the flow through the site.
Correct.
Not necessarily the actual presentation, the images or what the widgets or navigation tools look like, but the steps to get through.
Well, as much as the visual helps them
And the
go
visual
through those
is
steps.
the presentation, so the two have to go together.
Right.
But I can make the same website with the same content look very, very different by changing the visual. And by the same token, the same looking website can navigate very differently.
Right.
With different user experience. So the UX is how you get through it, and the visual is what's the experience while you're going through it.
So how you get through it, meaning you're there for a reason, right? You have as a user, you have some problem or some need. How that experience has been designed to help you resolve that, to solve that problem or that need, correct? Okay. So instead of waterfall, he talks about it should be a more iterative approach where from day one on a project, everyone should have something to do. So he goes as far as say, if your developers aren't writing code day one, your processes are broken. I mean that can seem pretty extreme, but but really from day one, there probably are things you can start doing.
Yeah, being a UX designer that was able to code my own prototypes, that was probably the most valuable thing, because I was able to iterate through design so quickly and user tests. We were able to iterate even between tests to see what was the most effective way to do things. And that doesn't have to be an edge case. Like, even if the designer can't code, you've got the designer and the coder right next to each other. And on every user study, and there's a certain kind of user study called right testing. It's rapid iterative testing and evaluation. And that right testing is about test, change, test, change, test, change. And you're going through about 20 users in the course of a week, and you're hitting about 80% of the problems. If you have a designer and a developer there, by the end of that week, you have a product. You don't have a design. You have an actual working product that was better than the design. And it's really, really, really powerful.
Yeah, good. Like you end up with good solutions, right? With this format. And this basically proportionally, maybe at the very beginning, the developer will be doing less, and at the end, we'll do the majority of the work. But the gist is, throughout the whole process, you're working together. So this is leveling up production. This is kind of where now he's getting into the whole idea behind atomic design, right? So what is atomic design? So it's a mental model that allows us to concurrently create the final UI and the underlying system, okay? It's a language for discussing the structure of our UI patterns and the patterns and the content that goes inside them. Basically, it's a buzzword that encapsulates the concepts of these modular design and development. Yep.
Sorry, go back to the other slide. Thanks.
Just a common language to talk about things. You'll see in a minute kind of where that's leading. So what it allows us to do is mentally traverse between abstract and concrete in a kind of a unified way, a shared understanding of that. And it's not rigid dogma. You can name things how you want. You can organize them how you want. This isn't like, this isn't scripture. This is basically, it's conceptual, right? It's to help you think about things in a particular way. And it's not a linear waterfall process. Like, we're going to go through a bunch of these steps. It's not a step-by-step. You do this first, you do that, right? It's supposed to be iterative. You're doing all these at the same time, potentially. So before we do that, we're going to do just a quick chemistry refresher, because he's used a lot of the chemistry metaphors. So in chemistry, atoms are, if you ignore parts of chemistry, atoms are kind of the basic building blocks of all matter, right? And you put two of those atoms together, you end up with a chemical bond. And then you start creating molecules together, you end up with organisms, okay? And so he's kind of pulling from, yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that I like from chemistry that kind of, I think, applies here is an atom, at the time that it was called the atom, was considered the smallest divisible unit.
Yeah. And that's kind of where he's going at here as well. He even in his book acknowledges, yes, I understand there's smaller units, but
that's why I don't really like the term microservices, because it infers something that really isn't true. It's, just because you can create a service that's super small doesn't mean that that's the smallest divisible unit.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have a service that consists of maybe multiple internal modules, but they're designed to work together as a single unit.
yeah, I think microservice is a terrible buzzword. Yeah, I agree. Any other comments? So he's basically pulling from those names. He talks about atoms, molecules, organisms. Then he breaks away from chemistry to templates and pages. Okay. So we're going to kind of go through each one of those. This is kind of the more instructional part of the conceptual. So atoms. So they are the foundational building blocks that comprise all our user interfaces, right? And what they kind of demonstrate global styles, meaning everything is built up from this. Everything inherits from your atoms. So an example of an atom on the web would be an HTML tag. Each of these tags in himself is an atom, right? Each one of them kind of contains its own unique attributes, kind of like the atomic chart, like a OL versus a UL versus a div. All these things kind of each atom has its own set of attributes and styles and default things, right? And maybe part of the things you would do at an atomic level would be normalization of these tags. You want to unify, usually you do a normalization to help with browser inconsistencies, but it can be used as the base. You can completely change for everything the base style of all of these atoms. It doesn't have to make them look like how the browsers make them look. You can actually set a normalized atomic structure that everything that builds from that is going to inherit. So you can completely get rid of bullets on an OL if you wanted to, and that's an atomic level normalization that everything that consumes that has to build up from. Does that make sense?
Do we have anything even remotely approaching this?
I'm sorry?
Do we have anything that even remotely approaches this with the church?
I think it not at this current time, probably not globally, but I think there are efforts to make global things like that. But individually across teams, there are many teams that do this, and you can as well.
Yeah, I was hoping that I would not be yet another team doing that.
There is a global effort to create something like that. Yeah. So atoms could be HTML tags. We talked about that and the normalization of that. But they also could be like your color palettes. Just here are your primary, secondary colors, just the colors that are going to all of your things building from that are going to inherit from. It could be your font stacks. The normalizations include like a default set of animations that everything is going to inherit from or use, right? And some of the products like after you've done this. If you were to complete this step, maybe the things you would see would be like CSS style variables that things can use, where you've defined all your colors and your font families, things like that, where all your font face definitions have been made, where you've actually applied a normalization or a reset, where you've defined what the hierarchy of fonts are going to be, spacing, just really basic low-level styles everything inherits from, including your media query ranges, and really all the foundational stuff.
What's great about this atomic level, if you think about it the right way, this atomic level can be shared across platforms. So you can have multiple sets of organisms that use the same atom principle, and those can be shared despite the technology used.
So you mean like a web versus a native mobile platform type thing? So building up from atoms, you start to get into what we call molecules. And these are relatively simple groups of atoms, and potentially maybe even other molecules, functioning together as a unit. So the key here is relatively simple. So an example here could be we're going to put together a label, an input, and a button, and we're going to create this thing called a quick form. Here is a molecule, right? And in this particular diagram, the use case is search the site. But we can use this quick form pattern to also subscribe to a newsletter or any other kind of time you have this pattern where you need to quickly collect information from someone and perform an action. Really simple, really quick data collection essentially. And these are usually really simple. They're very portable, very reusable, that can be dropped in anywhere where that particular functionality is needed. So it's just a super low-level base presentation component type of thing. And it kind of follows the Unix philosophy of doing one thing and doing it well. That's really what at this level of molecules, your molecules should focus on that. And some of the benefits of organizing things in this way is it makes testing easier, you have a lot of reusability, and you have a lot of consistency, right? So, if you look at this pattern up here, this could be styled hundreds of different ways across all of your pages or whatever. Actually taking the time to complete this step will give you this consistent pattern throughout all of the pages. From molecules, you build up into what he calls organisms. And these are the same idea. They're relatively complex UI components, and they're composed of groups of molecules, atoms, and or other organisms. So it's just think about they're more complex compositions of the lower level things and other molecules. An example would be like a site header, right? In this particular site header, it's consuming the quick form, right? And it's also inherited from the atomic level, the font stacks and the topography and anything like that. It has maybe this is a separate molecule. And really it's just about more complex, more opinionated components or composition of components, right? You still get some reusability, but it's not like they're less versatile than maybe those lower level molecules. And like these are a bunch of headers, site headers. And so these can compose many different elements, right? Like we talked about, or it could just consume the same element over and over again. But the idea is here is a more complex composition of things. And by building up from molecules to relatively complex organisms provides designers and developers with an important sense of context. So it just kind of helps organize patterns so you can talk about things in the same way. And the organisms, they demonstrate those smaller, simpler components in action and serve as distinct patterns. So it helps you, like the atomic level things and the molecular level things sometimes are more abstract and harder to kind of for people to think about potentially. And so getting into this level really helps you kind of see these things in action and provides really good context. So the next step along the way are templates. And this is where he breaks away from that chemistry metaphor because I guess keeping it would be going too far in his mind. And these are kind of page level objects that place components into a layout and it articulates the design's underlying content structure. So we're still not dealing with content itself, but the structure of content. So here's an example of that, right? Here's something without any content, but there's an implied content structure you're accounting for. And really, it's just giving you more context. You're focusing on the content structure versus the page's final content. And it says you can create really good experiences without knowing the content. You don't have to necessarily know the exact contents of the content, if that makes sense, to create a good experience. But what you do have to know is the structure of the content beforehand. And if you have the knowledge of that structure, then you can really create some good experiences, good user interfaces.
Are we to understand that the content structure needs to be strongly typed? Like, should we know the type of the content?
So this is
How much do we need to know about content to make content structure?
You should just the view model, not necessarily the values, but kind of. If you want to think about it, yeah, like the type, like the view model, whether if it's a hierarchy, whether they're strings, whether even more so than strings, but URLs or that kind of thing. You have a general idea of the content structure, the view model at this point. So it's a system that can account for a variety of dynamic content, all while providing the need. So basically, this gives you guardrails. Like you can account for a ton of content. Right, but it still gives you the guardrails that it's gonna still fit within a pattern. And then finally, the last part of atomic design is a page. And a page is a specific instance of a template that replaces that kind of that placeholder content or that dealing with content structures only to real representative content. So over on the left, there's the actual template, right? And on the right is the actual page. This is when real life content has come through your template to create a page. And this page is just one of hundreds of thousands of millions, potential pages that can be created from this one template. Does that make sense? So obviously this is the most concrete stage of atomic design. And it's what the user sees and oftentimes it's what the stakeholders sign off on, is that end page, right? But that's kind of like the very tip of a very complex system. That's his point. And having this step is essential for testing the effectiveness of the underlying system, right? Because you get the design in a Photoshop mockup where everyone's name is like Sam Smith, really small and always fits nice in a title thing, and images are always the same aspect ratios, and everything is great. But in real life, that's not how things are. There's a lot of variance there, and this system here helps you deal with that. You're able to kind of see all those things below it in action, how your system holds up when dealing with the variance of content coming into it. And like we said, you get to articulate all that variance here at this stage. So some of this variance would be a user has one item in their cart versus another one that has 10. So a web app's dashboard typically shows recent activity, but what happens when this is a first-time user and there is no recent activity, right? An article contains a 40-character long headline while another one has a 340-character long headline. So these are the kind of things you have to account for in a design system, and this step helps you do that. Or another example, a user who has admin privileges, what they see versus one that aren't admins, and really trying to create a mock-up for every possible variance in this ginormous truth table it's just not possible. And then he says, when things break, when you found that your system doesn't account for something, it's not fix it at a page level. You go back to where you need to, however deep down, and if it's at an atomic level, you fix it there. But the gist is you go back and you fix the underlying system that will then address and handle that potentially that edge case that you still need to account for. Questions, comments? Yeah.
So is there a suggestion based on what you've read so far as that last section that you talked about is handling all these different use cases and edge cases and different things like that? If we're developing from day one, what's the recommended pattern for trying to find these edge cases and explore them so that we don't have to publish the whole thing and then go back and then fix everything because we didn't properly.
So he talks about a good pattern library system essentially, where into the system you have built in both the ideal path where all the content is perfect and the worst. And so that's kind of this next section. Yeah, go ahead.
I think what's nice about breaking it down into these component structures and organisms is that you can test that organism isolated.
Correct.
So you can say, hey, let's test this title thing at 20 characters and 2,000 characters. Where does it break down? All of that stuff you can do at that very basic organism level. Then you can know that you're confident in the thing.
Right, it's that whole principle of modularity, making it simple and easier to reason about. Where it doesn't fit in, you deal with it at a very small scoped problem space versus the whole world problem space. So just kind of a quick review. Atoms are the UI elements that can't be broken down any further. Molecules built up from that. Organisms, templates, pages. So it's kind of all those explanations at a glance. I'm not going to read it because I have 5 minutes. But so pattern library, basically, if you follow an atomic mental model, you end up potentially with a pattern library in practice. So it's an actual product, right? And what it is a centralized hub of all the UI components that comprise your interface. Here's an example of what one that Salesforce has, where you can go through and you can see all those, the design probably covers all of those atomic level things, and then it gets into the different types of components or molecules and organisms. However you want to talk about them, you can. The gist is here is just understanding a mental model. I don't really like those terms. They don't register with me. To me, it's like a small, simple component and more complex components. They're all components to me. But here's an example of what a pattern library would look like. It's basically a centralized hub where all of these things exist. You can go look and see and test. You can test these things in action. You can check for that variance. All that should exist at a pattern library hub, right? And so here, I don't have time, but there's a live example where USA.gov has a pretty decent pattern library that you can check out. And actually the styleguides.io has a giant list of these things. Some of the benefits of a pattern library is it promotes the consistency. It actually speeds up your workflow. It's that shared vocabulary we talked about. There's a lot of documentation now that you can help educate stakeholders, colleagues, third parties. It helps testing, and it's kind of a future-friendly foundation for you to build off from. So instead of always dealing with things at an app level, you're building with things at a component level, which then yields different types of apps, if you want to look at it that way. So the good qualities of a pattern library are things that articulate the variance that Niels was talking about. You can view on the entire, basically see things in multiple contexts. So no institutional support to create a pattern library. He says do it anyways, right? That's what he says, not us. And the reason why he says that is because really, in order to create the whole, you're already creating the parts anyway. All he's talking about is organizing that process of creating the whole. And if you take that time to organize the parts, you have more, you're just more deliberate, more realistic, you're more efficient long term. And really this is kind of this is the process of getting something done. So whether or not it's a formal thing that the institution is, doing or not, it's really about process. It's your process of going from point A to point B, right? And really at the end of the day, if you're shipping on time and on budget, if you're not, then maybe you probably should be adjusting your processes anyway, honestly. So again, it's about getting organized. Instead of starting from a bunch of chaos and then building a car, you're actually creating this step in the middle that's organizing, your pattern libraries, essentially all the consistent UI experiences that allow you to do that. And so maintaining that pattern library moving on, it's not an afterthought. It's not like create the website and from that, I have all these little things because you follow this model, then the whole pattern library is just an afterthought and doesn't actually keep up, right? So it's more like you design, develop, you create the design system, and from that you get your app and you also get your pattern library. And here's, I'm not going to go through it, just even like a recommended or a potential, like a mental chart for adding things to your pattern library. Like, do you have similar? Does it already exist? If not, is there something similar? If there is, can it be modified to handle both use cases? Basically, a good process to determine how you extend your design system. And that's pretty much the end of it. There are some kind of funny quotes. Talks about Henry Ford's. Basically, he modularized the auto industry. And this gets in the idea of iterating quickly. Ideas are meant to be ugly. Like, you should feel like comfortable to try something. Just kind of a lot of interesting quotes, I thought. I'm not going to read them all out loud. So also we have, what Matt mentioned earlier in our React starters, we actually have created, a component authoring starter. So you can actually author a component or a molecule or whatever you want completely outside of a project. So this can help you to create that library of components that you reuse across projects. So just completely out of the context of an app, just to help you with that process. And then in our app starter, we actually have a separate runtime that is just for authoring these components within your app, completely outside the context of your app. It's just focusing simply on creating those atoms, molecules, organisms, all of that without actually being tied into data coming from endpoints or anything like that. So, that's it. Is there questions or comments on that?
Where are those located?
So you can install them. There's through NPM. You want to talk to me afterwards? I'll show you. There's a tool, LDS.js, that we've provided that lets you start Angular projects, React projects, Express.js projects, Angular Primer ones as well. But that'll basically lay down a project structure for you. Yep.
Just put in a shameless plug. There's going to be a great, well, I can't say it's going to be great, but there's going to be a presentation on that, on components, building components, kind of the component system that we're starting to build, that global thing that Jared was sort of,
Yeah. So Jaime, to answer your question earlier about something, there is a global thing being built. This is React Storybook. It provides this environment for authoring components, kind of outside the context of the app, right? So you're building it for the app, but it's not directly tied to the app. That's the whole perk. It gives you that reusability. And here you can kind of see some of here are the colors and the font families.
What's that color over 3 and down 3?
This one?
I like that was brought back.
This one? I don't know.
It's a pretty sweet color.
That's when the mood is gloomy and dark.
Yeah. I like that.
But this goes, this talks about normalization. We have, now we're talking about icons and buttons and badges, and basically this gives you an ability to kind of see if you had really good eyes. Kind of see things in context of the component, but out of context of the app, so that your apps can use these. If I'm speaking English, if I'm not, I'm sorry. But
It's like Latin.
But the gist is these will go into an app eventually, and maybe probably multiple apps or pages. But I'm authoring it completely agnostic to the fact that it'll go into which apps it'll go in. It's extremely, these things are reusable patterns that you can plug into systems later. Does that answer your question from earlier? So the end.